how do you feel about Donald Trump saying that he wants to terminate all articles found in the Constitution?
I mean, to what comment are you specifically referring?
Like his tweet on Twitter.
I mean, show of hands. Who takes everything that Donald Trump says seriously in this room? If you take everything that Donald Trump says absolutely literally, you might need to see a psychiatrist. Kamala Harris is a threat to the institutions of our republic. Not all at once there, guys.
Hi.
Hey, how's it going?
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
How's it going? All right, so I want to make sure that we have clarity. Can you specify when you say she's a threat to the institution so we can have a direct dialogue?
Okay, so when I say a threat to the institutions of the republic, I'm really talking about the constitutional institutions. So the Constitution is a very finely wrought document. It's created after an enormous amount of consideration, and the checks and balances of the Constitution, ranging from the legislature and to the executive to the judiciary, those things, messing with the actual institutions is, in fact, quite dangerous.
Pause. Can I inject? So
Sure.
when you say messing with, so we have somebody, our previous president, Donald Trump, right, who appointed people into the Supreme Court, right?
Yes.
And that have now put in act, they reversed Roe versus Wade, but they also put in act that a president can, under official acts, has immunity, legal immunity. So you don't think that messing with the three branches of governments that are official checks and balances in this country, what is based and paramount of the Constitution, which keeps it intact?
So as a constitutional lawyer, that's a fundamental mischaracterization of the Supreme Court decision. So the Supreme Court decision that you're referring to actually sets up a variety of sort of different options as to official actions by the president. There are unofficial actions by the president of the United States. If the president were to be sued for murdering somebody, for example, that would be outside the realm of official acts of the president of the United States. Then there are official acts of the president of the United States, which would be, for example, the president of the United States signs a tariff or executive order.
Understood.
And then there's sort of middle ground. The middle ground sets up a presumption that the president may have official action. It can be overcome by showing a cost to the actual cost of the system. That's what the Supreme Court decision says. So mischaracterizing it as President Trump could, for example, drone his opponents, that's not something that even Democrats believe. If Joe Biden believed that, presumably he would have tried to drone Donald Trump already. He doesn't like him very much.
Okay, so thank you for that. So we don't have a lot of time, so I want to respond, all right?
Sure.
So let's move to something that actually happens. We're not talking in hypotheticals. So Donald Trump was found guilty of inciting an insurrection. He has 34 felonies. So you don't think that that is a threat? You can't even vote in this.
That's not accurate. He wasn't found guilty of inciting an insurrection.
So
he was impeached by the House of Representatives. He was acquitted by the Senate.
Did Donald Trump incite an insurrection?
He did not incite an insurrection by any legal standard. I disagree with a lot of the stuff he did between the election.
So I'm not asking you by legal standard. I'm asking you, did he incite an insurrection, yes or no?
No. He did not incite an insurrection. Inciting usually requires you have to actually provoke the violence with intent to provoke the violence, not say peacefully protest at the House of Representatives.
So you know this as an attorney, right? Intent,
yes.
Right? Because you can have manslaughter and you can have murder. One's intent, one's not, but you still killed somebody, right?
Incitement is an intent crime. You cannot incite without intent on a legal basis.
Let's go here as a teacher, because I have a lot of history context and it's somebody that works in criminal justice reform. So he has 34 felonies, correct?
I mean, he's not been convicted of, if you're talking about the New York case, you're talking about the New York case?
I'm talking about the 34 felonies that he has on his, he's a convicted felon, yes or no? Because I want to make sure if we're talking, if we're saying that we're lawyers, we got to sit here and.
I'm so sorry, you've been voted out by the majority. Please return to your seat.
That was fun. Thank you anyway. It's like American Gladiator over here. Hey, how's it going? Hey, good to meet you.
Yeah, so how do you feel about Donald Trump saying that he wants to terminate all articles found in the Constitution?
I mean, to what comment are you specifically referring?
Like his tweet on Twitter.
Well, no, his tweet on Twitter actually suggested that he believes that, quote unquote, the election was stolen, a proposition with which I disagree. And he says that if that's true, then effectively the Constitution has already been nullified. That's not the same thing as saying he wants to obliterate all articles of the Constitution. I would also say that many of the things that Donald Trump says, show of hands, who takes everything that Donald Trump says seriously in this room? Really? All of you guys take everything he says seriously? He was indeed the president, and I would also recommend that if you take everything that Donald Trump says absolutely literally, you might need to see a psychiatrist. Donald Trump does not take even Donald Trump does not take everything he says seriously. There's no, in any case, go ahead.
Does he believe he won the 2020 election?
I think he does believe that he won the 2020 election.
So then it would be, under his view, it is true. Therefore, it is the case that he does want to terminate the articles found in the Constitution. So
whether or not he wants to terminate, he does not have the capacity to do so. One of the things that when we talk about dangers to the institutions of the Republic is not just an intent issue. So what I've talked about with regard to President Trump is that many of the things that President Trump has done are kind of dumb ways of trying to violate the articles of the Constitution, for example, and they tend to be struck down by the courts or nullified by, for example, the Senate of the United States, which certified the vote, for example, in 2020. What the Biden administration has done, what Kamala Harris does, is expand the scope of executive power in unprecedented and much more subtle ways that threaten the viability of those institutions. So, for example, using OSHA in order to cram down a vaccine mandate on 80 million Americans, for example, or when Kamala Harris talks about how she wants to get rid of the filibuster and thus stack the Supreme Court with a series of justices or increase the number of justices on the Supreme Court, which is an actual thing that she could do. The Republicans in the Senate, for example, have not said that they wish to get rid of the filibuster. Those are the kinds of threats to the institutions that I find significantly more credible than Donald Trump tweeting that he would like to make himself whatever he would like to make himself.
So wanting to terminate the Constitution, sending false slates of electors to Electoral College to cast Trump votes in 7 key states, even though he didn't win the election, those things aren't a threat to the public institutions that we have, especially when he gets a vice president that said he wouldn't have certified the election results?
I don't think they're a threat to the established institutions of the republic, specifically because those institutions work. It's when you start to thwart the actual internal workings of the institutions that you have a serious danger. I disagree with many of the things that Trump has done and said on these particular matters. And if effectuated, that would be a real problem. I just don't think there's much threat of that actually taking place. I mean, he did leave office when he was supposed to leave office, despite all of the insanity that took place between November and January in the last election cycle.
Yeah, so how does the OSHA mandate threaten our public institutions, but not the ones like, say, the abortion bans in certain states that restrict women's access to abortion, even instances where they've been assaulted?
I mean, that's not a threat to the public institutions. We're going to get to abortion later and we can disagree with the policy. That's not a threat to the fundamental working of the institution itself. OSHA was designed to protect occupational safety and health. It was not designed in order to cram down vaccines on 80 million Americans in a way that has nothing to do with its original mandate under the actual OSHA Act that established it in the first place.
Wait, so how does one threaten the public institutions, but the other one doesn't?
Because the role of a public institution is defined by Congress. Once you start to move beyond the role of that public institution without any sort of permission from Congress, that threatens the checks and balances as to how government works.
Did he get permission from Congress to send false slates of electors to Electoral College?
No, which is why they were rejected by Congress.
Okay, but they were rejected because of it not having sufficient basis to overturn the election, him not having sufficient basis to say that he won.
Correct.
Especially
Trying and
because
failing.
he was trying to send people to the Capitol specifically to get them to pause the proceedings, specifically to certify the election results.
Well, he said peacefully protest outside the Capitol, and we can get into
He said fight like hell. He sent the people there.
Fight like hell is
I'm not
a
saying
term of
he was
art,
trying
but
to get them to be violent. What I'm saying is it was to pause the proceedings specifically of certifying election results. So you can't tell me that it's not a threat to our public institutions from specifically to like try to limit them from certifying the election results, and for him to like try to get his vice president to not certify the election results, and to put himself over the Constitution by saying we should terminate the Constitution, like the articles found in the Constitution.
Okay, but the public institutions actually worked. The checks and balances worked. He tried many things, as you stated, and
But
all
isn't that a threat to them?
of them were stopped.
But that's a threat to them, correct?
I mean, he was threatening to do things that were not, that were then held back by the institutions. This is sort of my point. I'm not saying I'm not saying that President Trump has the best of intent with regard to all the institutions of the United States. What I'm saying is those institutions continue to properly function under him in a way that they would not under Kamala Harris or have under Joe Biden.
Yeah, so how does that not threaten the institutions to try to undermine our American democracy and get tens of millions of people to believe that the election was stolen when you agree with me, there's no sufficient evidence to indicate that?
Because a foolish attempt to say bad things about the institutions not fundamentally threaten the veracity of an institution nearly as much as undermining the actual working functionality of the institution, which has happened under the great expansion of institutional power in the executive branch, particularly under the Biden administration, and then the attempts to get rid of the filibuster, to stack the Supreme Court, to add states to the United States Senate by adding D.C. and Puerto Rico, for example, and adding 4 permanent Democratic senators, and thus upend the balance that was drawn by the framers. These sorts of things, I think, have more permanent, lasting ramifications than Donald Trump ranting and raving on Twitter and then achieving nothing in terms of the actual institutional damage.
So he could literally say that he wants to steal the next election, and you would say that that's not a threat to our institutions publicly?
I could say that I think that the things that he says about wanting to do things are generally not a threat.
Wait, so that's not a threat to our public institutions for him to say that?
Yes, I think a verbal threat to do things is not the same thing as an active. I think we ought to define threat here. When I say a threat to the public institutions, I mean a threat that is going to fundamentally undermine the institutions, not saying shit.
What about
Donald Trump says lots and lots of shit. In fact, it might be the epitaph on his gravestone, as Donald Trump, 45th president of the United States, said a lot of shit.
But you agree with me, he destroys the social fabric of this nation. Nice talking
That was
to you.
great. Oh, you got it. Wow. Well
Eddie
done.
boy, great to meet you. Really
Good to meet you
excited
as well.
for this. So it's interesting to me that you're saying the Occupational Safety and Hazard Administration shouldn't have the credence to protect the safety of occupations. Like, to me, that's something that's really silly. Can I ask a quick question just to clarify where we are on this issue? Do you think that vaccines are effective?
I think that it depends on the vaccine, but I am generally very pro-vaccine.
Okay, so why would you say that this is a government mandate when we're saying that when you're within a certain space, specifically in a closed space in a worldwide pandemic, that this administration shouldn't have the credence or the authority to make sure that people are protected?
So the Occupational Safety and Health Administration was set up by the OSHA Act. The OSHA Act was never held to apply to anything vaccine-related. It was just not.
Why should vaccines be an exception?
I mean,
if that protects people in a worldwide pandemic,
it's not about exceptions. It's about what exactly their actual creation mandate is to do. I mean, if you want to make the case that there ought to be work mandates for vaccines, then you got to make that case to Congress, and then Congress ought to actually pass a law saying that sort of thing. They weren't going to do that, and so the Biden administration, which literally said it did not have the authority to do this under OSHA, then attempted to use OSHA to do it, and the court struck it down.
But we could talk about the legality and how we can actually get something through the proper chambers. You're comparing that executive act by Biden to Donald Trump trying to overthrow democracy.
I mean, I'm actually not making that comparison. You're making that comparison. The comparison that I'm making is
you're saying that I'm saying that Joe Biden is being tyrannical in his move to protect people.
In his use of power.
And,
yes.
And how is that anywhere comparable to Donald Trump saying that the election was stolen or rigged against him?
Because let me ask you this. How did the actual institutions of the government change in response to Donald Trump saying that thing?
We have people right now that are elected to positions of office where they are guaranteeing that they would go with Donald Trump in his loyalty to keep him in power. And I mean, we have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. We have people like Sarah Huckabee. We have people like even J.D. Vance, who's new vice presidential nominee. These are all people that have said that they would have challenged the results of that election, something that you and I both agree shouldn't have been challenged.
I mean, I agree that the results of the election should not have been challenged once you had state certified electors. Also, it happens to be that in every single election cycle, there are people who actually vote not to vote in favor of the state certified elections. I mean, this happened, for example, in 2016 with Jamie Raskin, the congressman from Maryland, who also challenged the slates of electors.
Well, we can move from January 6th. What do you think about Donald Trump wanting to change civil servants to political appointees?
I mean,
don't you think that's a complete violation of our institutions?
Not at all. In fact,
in what way?
So I believe in unitary executive theory. The Constitution of the United States was directed around the idea that the executive branch is in control of executive branch employees. So if you're working in the executive branch, you work for the President of the United States. Who else do you work for? They're not independent agencies who are independent of the oversight of the President of the United States.
So you don't think that there should be a seamless transition regardless of what regime is changed every 4 or 8 years, instead of having it just be completely loyalist to the president that he can do at his whim?
I do not believe that there is a fourth branch of the government called the administrative state.
It's not a fourth branch of the government. It's helping the transition of the regime change. Do you think that there's any sort of efficacy that's happened in a democracy that continues to change every 4 years without people that are experts at what it is that they're handling?
Well, I mean, if
we're talking about national parks, these aren't just like executive cabinet members or secretaries of these particular executive administrations. These are people that are helping the upkeep of important institutions.
Right, so we're talking about
Donald Trump wants to remove.
Well, we're talking about hiring and firing power. Who has the hiring and firing power over these people? Do they get to be permanent employees of the federal government, unanswerable to the person who they work for? That's what we're talking about here.
This should be within the branch itself that have people that, again, allow that seamless transition.
So you're in favor of a fourth branch of government that was never contemplated by the founders?
It's not a fourth branch of government.
It is if they can't be fired by the executive.
The executive shouldn't have just unilateral control on just firing somebody because they're not agreeing with their particular agenda. That's what checks and balances are.
No,
and these are the institutions that he's trying to erode.
I mean, that's not a check or a balance. I mean, a check and a balance would be that if the president, for example, fires somebody unjustifiably, then Congress has impeachment power over the president of the United States. The idea that there's a check within the executive branch against the head of the executive branch defeats the purpose of having a separate executive branch.
Somebody like Anthony Fauci, appointed by Ronald Reagan, is somebody that's helped oversee pandemic response through multiple presidential administrations.
I mean, we can get to whether we think Anthony Fauci did a good or a bad job.
All right, I'm glad you disagree with Ronald Reagan and his choices.
Well, I mean, he could have done a good job under Ronald Reagan and done an incredibly poor job during COVID, which I think is probably the case.
Thanks, Ben.
Hey, thanks so much.
Talk in.
Just let me cook for like 3 minutes and I'll let you come up. Thank you, man. Thanks. Hey, man, nice to meet you.
Hey, good to meet you.
You guys were talking about civil service protections and the idea of like a fourth branch of government.
Yes.
So I want to lay out a case for you and why I think that Schedule F, which is what Trump implemented towards the end of his first term, could be used to, what you were saying, erode our institutions in this country. So at the end of Trump's first term, after he lost the election, he was putting a lot of pressure on his Attorney General, Bill Barr, to claim the election was fraudulent, even though Bill Barr said that's not the case. I'm not going to do that. Bill Barr ends up resigning, and then he replaces him with an acting Attorney General, Jeff Rosen. Jeff Rosen also refuses to do that, And then he finds this guy named Jeffrey Clark in the Department of Justice, who basically says, if you make me the attorney general, I'll send a letter to swing states falsely claiming fraud and sort of pressure them to send electors for you instead. The only reason Trump wasn't able to pull that off is because we had senior DOJ officials threaten to resign en masse. If Trump can replace those types of senior DOJ officials in a second term and circumvent Senate confirmation processes by having acting appointments, then that gives him a lot of free reign he shouldn't have without the check of Senate confirmation, for example, which is a check on the executive branch. And just one more thing, when we talk about things like OSHA, correct me if I'm wrong, but did that end up going through or no?
I know, because we sued them.
Right, so it was unconstitutional, right?
It was found unconstitutional,
sure.
Yes.
So the issue here is there's an interview J.D. Vance did, I think in 2018 or 2019 when he was a senator, and he basically said, if I was giving Donald Trump one piece of advice, I would tell him to fire every single civil servant in the administrative state, and then I would tell him if the Supreme Court stops him that he should defy the Supreme Court. So that is the vice presidential nominee of a major political party explicitly saying that he wants to create a constitutional crisis where the president of the United States has unilateral control over the executive branch, which is what enforces judicial decisions, and then he's going to disregard their decisions when it comes to appointing people.
So, I mean, I would agree that the Supreme Court of the United States does have the provenance of deciding these particular issues, and I disagree with JD if that's something that JD said, which I assume he did,
Sure.
since you're saying that. So when it comes to the sort of idea that you can just go right through all of the employees and fire everybody, and you'll just have acting, attorney generals forever, there will be no impeachment power on behalf of Congress, and that he'll send a letter to the states, and then you'd have to assume that all the states would then go along with this. You're assuming that every single part of every single branch of the government goes along with all of this.
Every single Republican, which so far we've seen that they go along with anything he does most of the time.
I mean, that certainly is not true. I mean, the election was actually certified by Mitch McConnell in the Senate,
Sure,
right?
Mitch McConnell is a very different type of Republican than like this new brand Republican, Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, even J.D. Vance.
Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene represent a fairly small percentage of the Republican Party.
Right, but with Trump as the nominee of the Republican Party, it's a totally different story, the types of Republicans he's going to be bringing into power. And you also talked earlier about
can I ask
Sure,
one question?
sure.
So, if you don't believe that the president of the United States has the summary ability to fire the employees who are existing within the executive branch, who does get to fire those people? And what is a fireable offense? And why should it be? Let's say Donald Trump comes in, let's say he does all of this, he puts in a bunch of his own employees. Should the next Democratic president have no ability to get rid of those people?
So I actually agree with the argument that we have a lot of inefficiency in our executive branch and we need a better method to remove inefficient bureaucrats and people that aren't working in accordance with what the institutions are supposed to do. But I think there needs to be safeguards in place so that the president isn't making those types of appointments on the basis of his own personal interest. Because if the president has pardoning power and he has now presidential immunity and he has the ability to pick and choose who's in the executive branch and he has the ability to disregard Supreme Court decisions, at that point you can call it a democracy, but effectively it's authoritarianism.
So
right? It's like the Viktor Orban model, which I saw your interview with him and he randomly started praising Viktor Orban. I don't want to see that kind of leadership in the United States.
So, I mean, listen, I would actually very much agree with the idea of paring dramatically back the powers of the executive branch, and Congress should seize back its power in a wide variety of ways. The question right now, I think, is who is more likely to actually expand the powers of the executive branch at the expense of Congress? And if you look at the expansion of executive power under, for example, Joe Biden, who has attempted to, say, relieve all student loan debt in the United States without any permission from a court, and then when the Supreme Court actually said you're not allowed to do that, he said, I found a way to go around that and try to do that again.
Sure.
There's a clever, I would say that, let's put it this way, I think that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are much cleverer about the ways they expand executive power than Donald Trump, who's a blunderbuss when it comes to his attempts to expand executive power.
When you talk about the student loan thing, again, this is an example of Biden trying to do something, the court saying you can't do it, him saying, okay, I won't do it that way, I'll do it a different way. And if that way was found to be unconstitutional, the Supreme Court would strike that down as well, and I would want him to oblige with that. The issue with Trump is, again...
But then he's trying to actually, get rid of the filibuster and then add justices to the Supreme Court in response.
The filibuster is it's something that can change. It's not necessarily like part of our institutions in the same way that our checks and balances are like a bedrock part of our institutions. And I want to talk about this idea of expanding executive power. If J.D. Vance is saying that Trump should disregard the Supreme Court, that is much worse than Biden implementing something and then Supreme Court saying stop and him saying, okay, I'll stop.
Well, he didn't say, okay, I'll stop about the student loans. He actually
He did it in a different way.
Okay,
he didn't do it
in a different way is him saying, I'm not going to stop. He actually brags publicly in his speeches about not obeying the Supreme Court and trying to find a way to end around what exactly they told him not to do.
That's kind of the purpose of the Supreme Court, is if the mechanism he's trying to use to implement his ideas is found to be unconstitutional, he won't do it that way, and he'll try to find a constitutional way to do it. If that's also unconstitutional, I have no problem with the Supreme Court stopping him. The issue here is that Biden actually listens to Supreme Court decisions. J.D. Vance has explicitly said, defy the Supreme Court, stand in front of the country like Andrew Jackson and say, the Supreme Court has made a verdict, now let them enforce it. So that's more explicit than anything Biden's ever done.
I mean, that's not true. Joe Biden put out a 3-point plan on how he would actually, quote unquote, reform the Supreme Court by use of the Congress of the United States. Again, getting rid of the filibuster, adding justices to the Supreme Court, limiting jurisdiction, putting term limits on justices of the Supreme Court. Now, the question, I think, is which party's excesses are more credibly going to take place. And it seems to me that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have been much more credible in their ability to get done many of the things that they've threatened to do in terms of restructuring government than anything that Donald Trump or J.D. Vance have actually been capable of doing. So perhaps the place of agreement that I think many of us are going to come to is maybe threats to the institutions are bad, and perhaps when it comes to both parties, we should assess which party is more credible in its threats to the institutions, who has been more effective, shall we say, at expanding the size and scope of government over the course of, say, the 20th and 21st centuries, the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, no matter what the excesses rhetorically both parties are using.
Sure. So when you talk about having issues with Biden reforming the Supreme Court, whether it's adding more justices or having term limits, that's a fair discussion to have, but that's like an entire order of magnitude below just straight up defying the Supreme Court. Like, you can say that's an issue, but it's just not on the same level of importance or severity as the chief executive saying, oh, Supreme Court said I can't do that. I'm just.
I mean, first of all, we do have a history in this country of that sort of thing happening. I mean, the tariff of nullifications in the 1830s with regard to Andrew Jackson, for example,
Right.
and there are tariff of abominations, rather.
I'm sorry, this claim is
great meeting you, man.
We're
Great,
out
thanks.
of
Yeah.
time.
That was fun, guys.